Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 3. This week, we're discussing finding selfhood and singularity within relationship. And when we talk about relationship, we're talking about relationship of self to community to race. And we're thinking about ideas like, how do we find ourselves? How do we create ourselves? How do we distinguish ourselves? How are we distinguished as an individual compared to a community or even a larger ethnic group? What do we keep that belongs to everyone? And how do we individuate ourselves? How do we find community? How do we build community? So here we have a quote from Langston Hughes. You'll be reading an essay this week called The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. It's a classic in literary theory, poetic theory, in Black history, in Black aesthetics, and American history in so many different ways. It marks a very distinct period of time that's still relevant today. So we have a quote from Langston Hughes. And we're also going to be watching a movie that was adapted from a novel written by Zora Neale Hurston. And she was a novelist, playwright, anthropologist, folklorist, and a priestess. She was a very interesting character, very brilliant woman who traveled the world to do research. Back to Langston Hughes, I meant to mention that he's a poet, a writer, a playwright, and he is a classic, iconic kind of person who is often quoted and often included in Black History Month for children when teaching children. Zora Neale Hurston too, but Langston Hughes, probably a bit more popular, maybe because he was male, maybe because he was a poet. So his work is a bit more accessible than novels. I'm not quite sure all the reasons, but for a long time, Zora Neale Hurston she wasn't as recognized as he was because a lot of different reasons, some intersectional issues. And so a Black feminist named Alice Walker, who wrote The Color Purple and other famous essays and novels, actually brought Zora Neale Hurston back up into the public eye in the 70s. And so since then, Zora Neale Hurston has been celebrated. The other interesting thing is that Zora and Langston were very, very, very good friends for a certain amount of time. They even did some research together on some Black history projects. They wrote some work together, and then they had a falling out, which no one really understands. There isn't really a lot of documentation about what happened, but they apparently had a fallout, and it lasted through the end of their lives. So I have quotes. I just pulled some. Zora Neale Hurston is well quoted as well. So I pulled a few quotes from the internet to put into this little slideshow. And Zora Neale Hurston's hometown is called Eatonville, Florida. That is one of the first incorporated Black towns in the United States. It was incorporated in the late 1800s. And when we watch the movie, Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is based on her novel, you'll get some insight probably into how she grew up. So this festival happens every year in her hometown. This is the movie poster for Their Eyes Were Watching God. And you can see Halle Berry, big A-list actress starring in the film. Some other people who weren't quite as big when it came out have become bigger since then. And we are going to see how an individual within a community is on a mission to build Black community and at the same time find herself. These are some images from the movie. And then I've been to Zora Neale Hurston's hometown. I visited myself because I'm just such a big fan of hers that I was driving through the South and thought I'd stop there and see what it was like. It's a very small town. One of the things that's interesting about, most interesting about being in the town that you wouldn't get from watching the film and reading her novels is how close it was to whites. It seemed like this Black town was sort of alienated, isolated, and nothing else was around it. Well, in actuality, it's adjacent to a very wealthy white community. Another concept that we're gonna brush on this week is the idea of the new Negro. And so there's a term called the new Negro movement as well, which is often synonymous with the Harlem Renaissance, pretty much so. Excuse me. And so this book called The New Negro is a compilation done by a philosopher named Alain Locke. And he actually is one of the people who has been thought of as one of the most significant people to the Harlem Renaissance for pulling in artists and writers and helping them to develop, coaching them, helping them get publishing deals, helping them get exposure, all of that kind of thing. And so he made a compilation that's a classic in African-American literature and also in American literature by making this anthology. And it has a lot of the very famous writers of the early 20th century in it. And then some of those artists and writers and poets and everything, they decided to rebel and create their own magazine because they kind of felt like the activists and the civil rights activists and the kind of older generation was putting too much control on the younger ones and what they were saying and how they were saying it, how they were making their art for arts, creative expressions. So here's a definition of the new Negro. And you can pause the video if you need to read it. An important thing to think about with the new Negro movement or this concept is that historically speaking, this was the first era where Black Americans started becoming urban, started moving in droves to urban cities, particularly the North. And then there was a concentration of artistic production in Harlem on purpose with the idea of creating a Black Mecca, a Black American capital, cultural capital in the United States. And so prior to that time, we have a very, very different era. So it almost seems like an explosion happened beginning around the 1920s. So you're going to read an essay by Langston Hughes called The Negro on the Racial Mountain, but also know that as much as he talks about literary and aesthetic theories, so does this essay by Zora and Hurston, Characteristics of Negro Expression. It's a pretty interesting read. We won't be reading this, it's not assigned in class, but I just wanted to mention it. And there's somewhere, and I could not find this quote anywhere, but I remember reading that Zora Neale Hurston said, there is no the new Negro. And so one of the things that you want to be thinking about is how every certain amount of time, there's a new name for this new idea of like a new type of Blackness or a new type of Black person. And so with the 1920s, we're talking about a sophisticated, artistic, cultured, maybe educated, urban Black Negro, as opposed to the Black person who was poor and a sharecropper and working in the South and uneducated without quote unquote class. Another quote from Langston Hughes. And here are a couple books by Langston Hughes if you're interested in going more into his work, a collected poems book. You can see a much younger picture of him. This is a fun book to read, The Ways of White Folks, if you're interested in microaggressions. If you're just interested in short stories that just give you, that are kind of funny and lighthearted a lot of the time and just very insightful. You want to see what it was like to be a Black person in this era and deal with certain types of white people. From the point of view of Langston Hughes, one of the most famous Black Americans in the United States at that time. It's a very interesting read. We're going to look at photographs by James Van Der Zee, who was a very prolific photographer. He was so prolific, in fact, that it's been said that he has the most photographs taken. He took the most photographs of any photographer in a 40-year section of his lifespan. In this self-portrait in 1918, we can see he's a young man. Well, he lived into his 90s. And so he began photography just a little bit before 1918. And he had his own studio in Harlem. And he lived in Harlem for most of his life, and he took over 100,000 photographs. And a lot of them, not all of them, were in Harlem of the Black communities in Harlem. His photos have become iconic. I mean, I can't tell you, before I knew his name, I've seen his photographs on every kind of Black book, in books on Black history. The images have been used over and over and over and over and over again throughout my whole entire life. Much the same way as Gordon Parks as well. But James Van Der Zee's photos are even more iconic because a lot of them focused on Harlem specifically. So these are a couple of his photographic themes. He would photograph famous Black people and do studio portraiture. So he had his own studio, and he even had like clothes and jewelry and props that his clients could dress up and use, because a lot of times they could barely afford to photograph, but they wanted to represent themselves in a certain way. And he wanted to help them be able to represent themselves in that certain way. So again, when we talk about the individual versus the community, these concerns were very much at the forefront of the activists and the artists of the 1920s. So Florence Mills on the left was an international, I call her a rock star, but she was, she came from vaudeville, and she did acting and singing and dancing. And she was kind of like the Beyonce of the 1920s. She was so popular that she had shows running over and over and over again. And they say she died from exhaustion, and 10,000 people came to her funeral in New York City. And many of the Black artists of the era did tributes to her. Marcus Garvey here was an activist and a social leader. He was Jamaican American. I think he was actually born in Jamaica and lived in Jamaica for most of his life before immigrating to New York City. Marcus Garvey led the largest social movement, I can't say social justice, mass social movement of popular consequence in the United States before Martin Luther King Jr. came along during the Civil Rights Movement. So Marcus Garvey is best known for advocating the Back to Africa movement. He tried very hard to convince Black people that we needed to all leave the United States, leave all these places to which whites brought people of African descent to become slave labor, leave every country and return to Africa and build up Africa, help to build up Africa and help it to develop, to reverse the effects of underdevelopment, which is what Europe did to Africa. So there are parades where James Van Der Zee would go, and he would take photographs of, not outside of his studio, he would take photographs in the street of different events and at different locations. Some of it we might consider street photography these days, but he had a very large amount of things that he would take photographs of. And we're also going to listen to a song by, it's been credited as being Duke Ellington's composition, but actually Billy Strayhorn wrote the composition. And Duke Ellington is probably the most prolific composer, definitely in African-American music, but possibly in the United States for that time period. And he was a jazz musician and a jazz composer. Billy Strayhorn was gay. And I'm bringing that up. I'll explain in a little bit later. Okay, I guess I'm explaining it now. I forgot that this slide comes next. African-American scholar, I think he's the chair of the African-American History Department at Harvard, Henry Louis Gates Jr. He's super, super famous. He's a rock star intellectual. He says the Harlem Renaissance was surely as gay as it was Black. And so this is you can watch this 2-minute video on YouTube called Queer in Harlem, 2-minute history Queer in Harlem. And it'll tell you a little bit more about that. There's a couple books on the topic. The book on the left, the writer won a MacArthur Genius Award last year, in 2019, I think. And the one on the left, dealing with similar themes. This is something we like to explore. You might want to check out these books. Looking for Langston is something that you can take a look at. There's a 5-minute clip that is this week. It's something that's more optional than required. Looking for Langston, speaking of in euphemisms about Langston Hughes, is a short art film that explores sexuality during the Harlem Renaissance and is kind of a tribute to Langston Hughes. And Langston Hughes actually recites one of his poems. There's clips of him reciting parts of a poem throughout the film. And again, when we talk about LGBTQ and Black queerness, we are also talking about how one finds the self in relationship to community, how one builds communities. And so in the recent TV show Pose, we find a community of people of African descent that are Black American, and some are from Caribbean islands or have Caribbean ancestry, and they may have African ancestry as well, who building a community in New York City around sexuality and gender difference. So how do they define themselves as individuals and a community in relationship to Blackness? And just going a step further, how do they define family? Moonlight is another film that came out a few years ago, within the past, I think 5 or 6 years. And it tells the story of a young Black boy who is struggling with sexuality, sexual orientation, coming of age in working class Black Miami. Here we see a scene from the film when he's a child with someone he looks up to in the neighborhood. And this actor won, he was nominated or he won an Oscar that year for this role. And this is the singer Janelle Monáe, who plays his girlfriend or his wife or his partner in the movie. She had a degree in musical theater before she became such a popular singer. Another quote from Langston Hughes, I've matched it up with a scene from the movie, Moonlight. And one of the things that I want you to notice about this early period of African-American history is that there was definitely a strategy on the part of the activists and the artists and the leadership to put the best foot forward all the time, to dress nicely, dress in suits, be polite, do everything possible to change this perception of Black people being ignorant and not having class. And so there's definitely a self-consciousness that comes about in much of the literature that we have, the literature and the arts that we have prior to the 1960s in African-American history. So Langston Hughes is thinking about that when he says this quote, "Negroes, sweet and docile, meek, humble, and kind, beware the day they change their mind." And that's basically what happens when we get to the 1960s. Not to say that it didn't happen before that, but it happened on a large scale in the 1960s. And so another thing that's included in this week is a clip or the trailer of this documentary called Stax. Well, Stax was a festival and it was a concert that happened in Watts around 1972 or 3. It was just a few years after a huge riot broke out in Watts about something that had to do with police brutality. And so it was a devastating riot and with ramifications, you know, politically throughout the country for a few years. So this concert was put on to kind of heal Watts, heal the nation, heal the Black people. So this is a shot of one of the performances, and it had an all-star lineup of musicians who are represented by, I think it's the Stax label or Stax Records, something like that. Someone have to fact check me on that one. So the last image I have here is this, the first one that's on the title slide for the slideshow. And again, I just want you to be thinking about this week, the self, community, and relationships in a state of movement, a state of movement. So not in a state of stasis, meaning staying still, but constantly changing, constantly moving, constantly exploring. It's something that's constantly shifting. And so this is a deep sort of image of part of one of Aaron Douglas's murals. And Aaron Douglas was a painter. He made a lot of murals during the 1920s and 30s. And you can see here the movement of a painting, a sort of mural that tells a story of movement of, you see mostly males here, male figures, but it's supposed to represent the Black community, the Black history, the Black narrative, the African American narrative in the United States. So look closely at that and you can see how it shifts and changes, and what kind of actions people are taking to create change. And as this figure in the center is pointing, what are they pointing to? Where are they trying to go? Why? And how are they going to build community each time they move? How do they find self within relationship to that community each time? So that's the introduction to the week, or the overview, I should say. Thank you very much for listening.